Hello, we're the Malt Miller, and today, as part of our Brew With Us series, we're at Utopian Brewery in Devon.
So Jeremy, we finished our brew day looking at fermenting the wort. What can you tell us about your fermentation steps and practices here that we can try and do ourselves with our brew?
Yeah, for sure. So after the brew day, after we boiled the wort, we do a whirlpool to get the hop shrub separated, and then we chill the wort down to about 7 degrees, which is quite cold for a lot of home brewers, for a lot of professional brewers as well. But again, we're looking to be as traditional as possible to limit sort of yeast expression in a way, so higher alcohol and ester production. And the colder we keep the temperature from the minute that we add the yeast until the end of fermentation, the cleaner the beer is going to taste. So the more the malt profile and the hops will come through versus sort of fruity ale type yeast flavors. So we chill the wort down to 7.
Yep.
We pitch our lager yeast. We're reusing our lager yeast for up to 10 generations. But the important thing is that you've got quite a lot of healthy, happy yeast cells, especially when you're pitching at lower temperatures. From there, the fermentation begins usually within 24 hours.
Right.
And our max temperature during fermentation is 9 degrees Celsius.
Wow.
And so we're, again, quite cold. But even at that temperature, we finish fermentation in about 7 days. So it is quite quick just because of the amount of yeast that we're using and how healthy the yeast is.
So basically you're turning it around in 7 days in fermentation before it then goes into tank for lagering. Because one, you're pitching good, strong, healthy yeast. You're pitching at low temp and keeping it there. So as a home brewer, typically we would there's a different methods that you can and read about people doing, such as like starting high to build your yeast up and then bringing it down. What are your kind of thoughts around doing that kind of methods?
So what's really critical to beer flavor is that sort of initial 12 to 24 hours after you pitch the yeast. So during fermentation, your ester and your higher alcohol production from the yeast is really concentrated at the front end of fermentation. Temperature plays a massive role in how much higher alcohols and esters the yeast produce. So if you start warm, then start to drop the temperature, depending how quickly you can drop the temperature, you're already going to have a lot of higher alcohol, a lot of this sort of fruity character, which
Right.
it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's not what we're looking for in our beers. We're trying to keep them as clean as possible.
Yeah, so if that higher temperature, if that's where the higher percentage of alcohol is actually produced, it's going to taste more ale-like than lager-like, and that's why you guys are going low and staying low.
Exactly. And I mean, as long as you're pitching enough yeast, you don't really want a ton of yeast growth in your actual fermentation. You just want enough yeast that it ferments out strong, but you're not trying to propagate yeast. You're trying to ferment wort. And if you ever taste a starter, it's not delicious tasting beer, right? Like, it tastes yeasty, it's got some weird flavors going on. And if you start really warm and aerate the hell out of it, then you're trying to turn your entire batch of beer into a yeast starter, which isn't what we want.
So in terms of after your 7 days of fermentation, it then goes what, into your tanks, your conditioning tanks?
Yeah.
Here, and how long is it sitting in here for?
So we transfer it, at the end of fermentation, we chill the beer down to 5 degrees. So we allow a lot of the yeast to come out of suspension because we need to take the yeast out of the bottom of the tank so we can reuse it, usually within a day or two.
So that's still in the conical before it comes to the tank?
That's
okay.
Still in the conical. So really, maybe getting a bit too technical, but by like day 5, usually we start chilling the active fermentation slowly down to 5. So by the time the beer is fermented out, it's already at 5 degrees. And we can harvest yeast, and then at 5 degrees, we transfer it into one of our lagering tanks, which is just a dish-bottomed fermenter.
So at this stage, when it's going into the lagering tank, it's pretty clean. Has it been?
It's still got a decent amount of yeast, but a lot less yeast than it has. So it looks quite turbid, quite cloudy, but the flavor is reasonably clean. There's a bit more sulfur that's going to come out. There's diacetyl or potential for diacetyl at that point, because we haven't done a diacetyl rest, which we can talk about. Yeah, so we leave it at 5 degrees until our diacetyl is clear, which is a check that we do sort of by heating up a bit of the beer and doing a sensory analysis to find out if there's still diacetyl in. Yeah. For the home brewer, where you're less pressed for time, you can just leave it longer. And the diacetyl should clear up on its own at 5 degrees if you give it enough time, like a week or two.
Okay.
From there, we so what were we at? We were at a week in the fermenter.
Yeah, a week in the fermenter. Then you'll slowly bring it down.
A week at 5 degrees Celsius in the lagering tank.
Yeah.
And then we'll bring it down to 0 and let it lager for the premium lager. It's another 2 weeks at 0 degrees.
Okay, so at this point, there's still going to be yeast sediment in the bottom. What I'm thinking now is, as a home brewer, not everyone's got a conical. Some will have a plastic bucket. So if they've got temperature control and they've got it in their fridge, they drop the temperature down, that's still sitting on the original yeast cake. Is that going to have any issues, or should they consider actually transferring it from that plastic bucket to a clean plastic bucket?
It's I think it's a debate that's been going for a little while. From what I know, due to the hydrostatic pressure, so we're talking about big tall tanks, and they're under pressure, so we've got a half a bar pressure on the tank to carbonate. The yeast is very unhappy in the bottom of one of our tanks, and the yeast in the bottom of a plastic bucket is under far less stress. That's not to say that it's all happy and alive and you won't get any yeast dying, but that's essentially the danger. The longer you leave beer on the yeast, the more yeast cells are going to die because they don't have anything to eat, they don't have any oxygen. So there's definitely an argument to, after your main fermentation, once you've got whatever it is, an inch of yeast sediment on the bottom, there's an argument to transfer that off. At the same time, you do risk a bit of oxidation.
Yeah, so unless you can actually purge the vessel you're transferring it to.
Yeah, or if you're setting up a secondary fermentation with for like bottle conditioning, or if you're keg conditioning and you're going to be adding more sugar anyways, then that sort of alleviates a lot of the issue with oxidation, because the yeast is just going to
Push it out.
heat it up again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is bottling something you would actually consider something you can do with lager without too much of a risk to it?
As long as you're bottle conditioning, I think you can. I think you can definitely do that. It might look like something like you've got your cold fermentation going at, I don't know, 10 degrees or something. You let it ferment out completely, and you just leave it at 10 for, let's say, 2 weeks, something like that, and then the majority of the yeast is going to drop out over 2 weeks anyways.
So it's just naturally going to drop out. If you can reduce the temperature, that's even better.
It's going to drop out even more, yeah.
And then you can look at either packaging it into keg or bottle.
Yeah, and if you transferred it at that stage 2 weeks in, then either you can force carbonate in a keg and stick it in a freezer set to 0 for a couple of weeks of lagering, and then it's good to drink. Or if you go into bottle, you could leave it warmer for about a week to get some condition, and then put those into a freezer to lager. Yeah, you're going to get some different effect, I guess. Lagering in a bottle versus lagering in a batch lagering in a keg, but I'm not sure how much research has been done into that.
But I mean, I guess it's kind of like you choose which method. You have the access to equipment to do that.
Yeah.
And it's not that there's one's right or wrong. One will give you one result and one will give you a different result. And as you develop as a home brewer, you can kind of switch your methods and change to different ways of doing it.
Exactly. I mean, the vast majority of the time, using the kit that you have, keeping things as simple as you can is the best method. As long as it's not simple to the point of just laziness.
Yeah.
But simplicity is good. The more you move beer from one vessel to another, the more risk you have of infection and oxidation. So just trying to keep things pretty simple goes a long way. Yeah, and as far as lagers go, like we said, healthy yeast, keeping it colder, plenty of it, keeping the fermentation cold. Those are sort of those are the keys. If you do that, a month later you'll have really drinkable beer. I think the effects of how you lager it, batch lagering, bottle conditioning, forced carbing the keg, that's all very much secondary. Every brewer can sort of work out their own step for that. If the beer, regardless in what way, if it's had a couple of weeks at around 0 or a month at around 0, it'll drop bright, it'll taste good, as long as you got those early steps right.
Brilliant, that's great. Thanks very much, Jeremy.
Cheers.
Cheers.